frequency and fall, consciousness, unidentified aerial phenomena, and the physics of the soul. Prologue, the question we were afraid to ask. For nearly a century, we have stared at the same evidence and reached the same dead end. Objects that move without inertia, encounters that alter perception, memory, and emotion, events that ignore distance, violate time, and mock propulsion, phenomena that appear ancient, symbolic, absurd, and yet precise. Each generation updates the vocabulary. Airships become flying saucers, saucers become craft, craft become unidentified aerial phenomena. But the behavior never changes. The mistake was not in the data, it was in the assumption we carried into it. We assumed the phenomenon was external, something arriving from elsewhere, crossing space to reach us. We assumed it was technological because it appeared advanced. We assumed it was physical because we are. And when those assumptions failed, we added complexity instead of questioning the frame. More dimensions, more civilizations, more timelines. Yet the evidence kept bending inward. Witnesses didn't just see something, they were affected. Time fractured, identity blurred, emotion intensified. Fear, awe, paralysis, obsession, responses far out of proportion to a visual stimulus. The phenomenon did not behave like visitors, it behaved like something that already knew us. Religion noticed this long before science did, and then refused to speak of it. Science noticed it too, and refused to speak of why. Between them grew a silence, filled with speculation but starved of synthesis. Angels and demons were dismissed as superstition. Unidentified aerial phenomena was dismissed as misidentification. Consciousness was labeled subjective and removed from the equation. And so the one place all the evidence pointed, the human interior, was declared off-limits. What if that was the error? What if the phenomenon does not primarily traverse space, but states? What if it does not enter our world from elsewhere, but intersects it through frequency, coherence, and collapse? What if the true anomaly is not the craft, but the soul? This book does not argue that ancient myths were really aliens, nor that modern sightings are religious visions. That is merely trading one reduction for another. Instead, it proposes something more uncomfortable. That reality is layered not only by dimensions, but by alignment. That coherence and entropy behave like physical laws. That consciousness is not emergent, but instrumental, and that humanity occupies a rare and dangerous position within this structure. A position that allows ascent, a position that allows corruption, a position others may have lost. If this is true, then the phenomenon is not random. Disclosure is not about technology. And the battle, quiet, persistent, escalating, is not for territory or resources. It is for access. The question we avoided asking was never whether we are alone. It was whether we are free, and what happens if we forget why. Chapter 1. The phenomenon that refuses to be physical. If the phenomenon were purely technological, it would likely be more tractable within existing explanatory frameworks. For over 70 years, governments, scientists, engineers, and intelligence agencies have examined radar returns, pilot encounters, sensor data, satellite imagery, and eyewitness testimony. The volume of information is vast, the sophistication of the observers is unquestionable. And yet the conclusions remain evasive, circular, and incomplete. Not because the data is weak, but because it refuses to behave like matter. The objects accelerate without inertia. They turn at angles that would liquefy biological tissue. They appear and disappear without transitional motion. They enter water without displacement. They leave no exhaust, no heat bloom, no sonic signature. These are not minor anomalies. They are categorical violations. Every proposed propulsion system, chemical, nuclear, ion-based, electromagnetic, warp-adjacent, fails at the same point. Inertia. Physics does not allow mass to behave this way without compensatory effects. And yet, again and again, the objects do. The more precise the sensors become, the more troubling the results are. But the true fracture in the physical explanation does not come from the objects themselves. It comes from what happens to the people who encounter them. Pilots report lost time, intrusive thoughts, sudden emotional flooding, or an uncanny sense of being observed before visual contact. Civilians experience paralysis, overwhelming fear, or profound awe unrelated to threat. Some report long-term psychological or spiritual effects, obsession, depression, transformation, or aversion. These are not standard reactions to seeing advanced machinery. A stealth bomber does not collapse identity. A hypersonic missile does not fracture memory. A foreign drone does not induce existential dread. Yet the phenomenon routinely does all three. This presents a problem that material science has no language for. The encounters behave less like sightings and more like intersections. Events where perception, cognition, emotion, and environment are altered simultaneously. The physical component is present, but it does not dominate. It almost feels secondary. As if the visual manifestation is not the primary interface. As if the object is not the message. Time distortion is another persistent feature. Missing time is reported across decades, cultures, and levels of credibility. Not subjective time, measurable gaps. Watches stop, radar logs skip, events begin and end without continuity. Physics can explain time dilation at relativistic speeds. It cannot explain localized, selective temporal disruption experienced by observers at rest. Unless time is not the axis being manipulated. Unless consciousness is. Again and again, attempts are made to anchor the phenomenon in external mechanics. Advanced civilizations, artificial intelligence probes, von Neumann machines, time travelers, parallel universes. Each hypothesis extends the distance between us and the answer, while leaving the core mystery untouched. Why does this technology behave symbolically? Why does it adapt to cultural expectations? Why does it reveal itself obliquely instead of overtly? Why does it generate belief rather than clarity? Advanced civilizations would have no reason to communicate through absurdity. Scientists do not test instruments by traumatizing them. Explorers do not hide behind folklore. Unless the ambiguity is not a flaw, but the mechanism. When viewed across history, the phenomenon does not trend toward revelation. It trends toward disruption. It unsettles. It destabilizes. It fragments consensus while reinforcing personal conviction. Two witnesses can see the same event and leave with opposite interpretations. One technological, one spiritual, one meaningless, one life-altering. That is not how external objects behave. It is how mirrors behave. This is why the phenomenon has resisted classification. It does not occupy a single domain. It manifests physically, but not reliably. It communicates, but not clearly. It influences thought, but not uniformly. It appears real enough to be undeniable and ambiguous enough to be dismissed. It exists in the overlap, where science grows uncomfortable and theology grows quiet, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if the phenomenon is not primarily physical, but relational? What if it interacts not with space-time alone, but with states of coherence within the observer? What if its technology is not propulsion, but modulation? Of perception, emotion, memory, and meaning. If that is the case, then the greatest error in modern investigation has been the exclusion of the human interior from the model. We have treated consciousness as contamination instead of instrumentation, and so we have been studying the shadow while ignoring the surface it falls on. Before we can understand what the phenomenon is, we must first understand what it is not. It is not consistent enough to be machinery alone. It is not distant enough to be extraterrestrial in the classical sense. It is not chaotic enough to be random. And it is not benign enough to be neutral. It behaves like something constrained by rules, but not ours. Something ancient, but adaptive. Something intelligent, but indirect. Something that cannot fully enter our reality, yet cannot stay entirely outside it either. Which leads to the question modern science never wanted to ask. What kind of intelligence would need us in order to appear at all? To answer that, we must step backward, not forward, into history, myth, and memory to trace the phenomenon before it learned to wear metal skins and radar signatures. Because long before it became unidentified, it was already known, just by different names. Chapter 2, From Angels to Airships. Long before radar screens and cockpit cameras, the phenomenon was already here. It did not arrive with jet engines or nuclear reactors. It arrived with symbols. In medieval Europe, luminous beings descended from the sky bearing messages of warning, judgment, or instruction. They paralyzed witnesses, induced terror or awe, erased memory, and departed upward into light. In the Middle East, they were called angels and jinn. In Celtic lands, they were the fair folk, beautiful, deceptive, dangerous, and bound by strange rules. In Scandinavia, they rode fire in the sky. In the Americas, they emerged from mountains, clouds, or beneath the earth. They did not behave like gods. They did not behave like animals. And they did not behave like travelers. They behaved like intermediaries. These beings rarely revealed themselves openly. They spoke in riddles. They demanded secrecy. They punished curiosity. They abducted selectively. They altered lineage. They warned of catastrophe and promised knowledge, often at a cost. Most telling of all, they changed their appearance. The same intelligence that once appeared as winged messengers later appeared as shining wheels, flaming chariots, skyships, and floating shields. By the late 19th century, during the Industrial Revolution, it began to appear as mechanical airships, complete with propellers, rivets, and crew in workman's clothing. This period, known as the airship wave of the 1890s, presents a problem no technological explanation can resolve. Witnesses across the United States and Europe reported large, slow-moving craft with human-like operators who spoke English, asked for water, discussed engines, and claimed to be inventors. Yet no such technology existed, no infrastructure supported it, no patents preceded it, and the designs were often inconsistent, more theatrical than functional. The phenomenon had learned a new costume. When powered flight became real, the airships vanished. When rockets entered public imagination, the phenomenon returned as discs and cigars. When computers emerged, it became metallic, geometric, and cold. When consciousness entered the cultural foreground, encounters shifted inward, telepathic, symbolic, dreamlike. The intelligence did not lead culture, it followed it. This pattern is not subtle. It is continuous, adaptive, and global. The phenomenon presents itself at the edge of what a culture can almost, but not quite, comprehend. Always advanced, never incomprehensible, always ambiguous, never undeniable. This alone dismantles the idea of a static, external civilization observing us over millennia. A civilization does not redesign its vehicles to match folklore. A reconnaissance mission does not masquerade as mythology. Explorers do not downgrade their clarity to preserve mystery, unless the appearance is not the vehicle, but the interface. This is where the work of Passport to Magonia becomes unavoidable. Vallée demonstrated, with exhaustive documentation, that modern unidentified aerial phenomena encounters are behaviorally identical to ancient religious and folkloric visitations. Not similar, identical, the same absurdity, the same secrecy, the same selective contact, the same manipulation of belief. And yet Vallée stopped short of the implication. He showed continuity, but avoided ontology. John Keel went further. In Operation Trojan Horse, Keel proposed that the phenomenon represents an intelligence native to Earth, but not bound to its physical surface. He described it as deceptive, adaptive, and capable of influencing belief systems. He noticed its obsession with symbolism, fear, and confusion. He recognized its tendency to fracture consensus rather than build it. What neither Vallée nor Keel fully articulated was why the phenomenon behaves this way, why it never lands on the White House lawn, why it never offers proof that cannot be doubted, why it refuses to be cornered into material explanation, why it repeatedly re-enters history under new disguises. The answer is not that it enjoys trickery. The answer is that direct revelation is impossible. Throughout history, these entities appear constrained. They operate through thresholds. They require invitation, ritual, emotional intensity, or altered states. They obey strange rules about names, times, places, and permissions. They cannot fully manifest at will. In folklore, iron repels them. Names bind them. Light exposes them. In theology, they require consent. In modern encounters, they require proximity, attention, psychological openness, or trauma. Different language, Same rule. They do not cross freely, they interface, and interfaces adapt to the system they connect to. Angels wore wings because flight was symbolic, not mechanical. Airships wore propellers because industry was symbolic, not capable. Unidentified aerial phenomena wear physics-defying forms because physics is now our highest authority. The phenomenon does not challenge belief directly, it tests alignment. This is why ancient people interpreted encounters morally, and modern people interpret them technologically. The event is the same, the frame is different. The meaning is supplied by the observer, and that meaning shapes the outcome, which explains something even more disturbing. When belief systems shift, the phenomenon does not disappear. It waits. Centuries can pass in silence. Then suddenly, waves return, always during periods of social upheaval, technological transition, or spiritual fracture. The timing is not random. The phenomenon does not announce itself during stability. It emerges during liminality. Empires collapse, worldviews fracture. Old gods die, new sciences rise, and something slips through the cracks. If this intelligence were external, it would not need to obey the rhythm of human meaning. But if it depends on meaning, if it manifests through belief, perception, and consciousness, then history itself becomes its medium, which reframes myth entirely. Myth is not primitive science. Myth is compressed encounter memory. Stories survive because something happened. Symbols persist because they describe interactions that could not be explained directly. Theology, folklore, and scripture are not attempts to understand the natural world, but attempts to survive contact with something that does not belong to it. The modern mind dismisses this because it assumes progress equals clarity. But what if progress merely changes the mask? If the phenomenon once called angels now flies as machines, then the question is not whether ancient people were naive. The question is whether we are. To understand why the phenomenon abandoned wings for metal and why it now threatens to abandon bodies altogether, we must confront the explanation modern culture resists most: that what we call technology may be the least important part of the encounter, and that the true continuity across history is not craft, but consciousness. Chapter 3: The Limits of the Extraterrestrial Hypothesis. For all its popularity, the extraterrestrial hypothesis was never a conclusion. It was a convenience. When flying discs entered public awareness after World War II, humanity stood at the threshold of spaceflight and nuclear power. The idea that visitors from other planets might be observing us felt not only plausible, but flattering. It preserved human centrality while relocating the mystery safely beyond Earth. We did not ask whether the hypothesis fit the evidence. We asked whether it was comforting. At first glance, the extraterrestrial model seems reasonable. The universe is vast, life is statistically likely, advanced civilizations could exist, probes could be sent, observers could watch emerging species. None of this violates physics, in theory. But theories do not explain patterns. And the deeper investigators looked, the more the hypothesis began to fray. If the phenomenon represents advanced extraterrestrial technology, then its behavior is inexplicable. It violates every principle of efficient exploration. It conceals itself unnecessarily. It traumatizes witnesses. It refuses sustained contact. It produces confusion instead of data. An advanced civilization capable of interstellar travel would not need to abduct civilians in bedrooms. It would not communicate through fragmented symbolism. It would not hover silently for decades without making its presence unambiguous. More importantly, it would not behave inconsistently. Yet inconsistency is the phenomenon's defining trait. Craft sizes vary wildly, shapes shift, occupants range from humanoid to monstrous to indistinct. Messages contradict one another. Motivations oscillate between benevolent warnings and cold indifference. Sometimes the entities claim to be from distant star systems. Other times, they refuse to explain themselves at all. These are not the signatures of explorers. They are the signatures of adaptation. One of the most damning features of the extraterrestrial hypothesis is its failure to explain absurdity. Witnesses frequently report elements that seem nonsensical or theatrical. Strange uniforms, meaningless procedures, comical gestures, illogical commands. The encounters feel staged, as if designed to provoke reaction rather than convey information. Absurdity is not a bug in the data, it is the data. No serious scientific mission would include performative nonsense. No intelligence-gathering operation would compromise itself with spectacle. Yet the phenomenon repeatedly does both. This alone should have ended the extraterrestrial debate. Instead, it was ignored. Another fracture appears in the phenomenon's apparent indifference to biology. Abduction narratives describe invasive procedures performed with crude methods despite supposed technological superiority. Reproductive programs are hinted at without clear objectives. Genetic manipulation is implied but never explained. Results are never demonstrated. If these beings possess the ability to cross interstellar distances, they would not struggle with tissue sampling. Unless the body is not the target. Time creates another irreconcilable problem. Reports of encounters span centuries, possibly millennia. For extraterrestrials to be responsible, they would need to monitor Earth continuously across the rise and fall of civilizations, adapting their appearance and behavior to match human belief systems, without ever establishing contact or intervention. This is not observation, it is entanglement. The hypothesis collapses further when we consider proximity. The phenomenon appears disproportionately near humans, homes, vehicles, military assets, emotional centers. It does not map to astronomical significance. It does not correlate with exoplanet discovery. It does not follow cosmic logic. It follows us. Even when advanced technology is invoked, self-replicating probes, artificial intelligence scouts, time travelers, the same problems persist. These explanations merely push the mystery outward without addressing the core behavior. Why interact psychologically? Why influence belief? Why destabilize meaning? Why generate myth? The extraterrestrial hypothesis assumes the phenomenon exists independently of human consciousness. The evidence suggests the opposite. This is where the work of American Cosmic becomes important. Pasulka documented how unidentified aerial phenomena experiences function less like encounters with machines and more like religious events, complete with conversion, secrecy, pilgrimage, and reverence. She observed that the phenomenon produces belief systems, not technologies, but even here the conclusion remains restrained. To fully confront the data, we must accept something uncomfortable. The extraterrestrial hypothesis fails not because it is too strange, but because it is not strange enough. It attempts to explain a phenomenon that behaves symbolically, relationally, and psychologically using a framework designed for rocks and rockets. It treats meaning as an after-effect instead of a driver. Once meaning is restored to the center of analysis, a new picture emerges. The phenomenon does not arrive from far away. It arrives from elsewhere in state. It does not traverse distance. It traverses thresholds. It does not need propulsion. It needs access. This is why it appears during altered states: sleep paralysis, trauma, ritual, meditation, psychedelics. This is why it resists instrumentation while influencing witnesses. This is why it operates through suggestion rather than force. The extraterrestrial hypothesis assumes intelligence is located. The phenomenon behaves as if intelligence is distributed, not across stars, but across layers of reality that overlap our own, constrained not by space, but by coherence. Once this possibility is acknowledged, the question shifts. We stop asking, "Where are they from?" and begin asking something far more dangerous. What are the conditions that allow them to appear at all? To answer that, we must introduce the axis. Modern science refuses to acknowledge the dimension that governs not distance or mass, but alignment. We must talk about frequency. Chapter 4: Frequency, the missing axis of reality. Modern science is comfortable with dimensions: length, width, height, time. These can be measured, modeled, and manipulated. Even additional dimensions, folded or hidden, can be discussed mathematically without discomfort. What science resists is not complexity, but implication. Frequency, as it appears in this book, is not a mystical metaphor, nor is it reducible to vibration in the New Age sense. It is a functional descriptor for a property we already observe everywhere, but refuse to unify. Frequency describes state. A system can be coherent or incoherent. ordered or entropic, aligned or fragmented. These states are not moral judgments, they are physical realities. A laser is coherent light, noise is incoherent sound. A crystal lattice holds structure, a gas disperses. One form resists decay, the other accelerates it. The universe favors coherence locally and entropy globally. This is not philosophy, it is thermodynamics. What we have failed to consider is that consciousness too appears to operate under similar constraints. Human experience is not neutral. Certain states stabilize perception, identity, and meaning. Others dissolve them. Love, sacrifice, and purpose produce integration. Fear, addiction, rage, and despair fragment attention and selfhood. Trauma collapses time. Obsession narrows reality. These are not merely psychological effects. They are state transitions. In physics, when a system changes state, solid to liquid, ordered to chaotic, it crosses a boundary. Energy is absorbed or released. Rules change, behaviors shift. The system becomes something else. Why would consciousness be exempt? Frequency, in this framework, describes the degree of coherence a system can sustain. High-frequency states are integrated, stable, and relational. Low-frequency states are fragmented, unstable, and self-referential. One resists entropy, the other accelerates it. This does not mean one is good and the other bad in a moralistic sense. It means they behave differently, just as ice behaves differently from steam. What religion called sin and holiness may be primitive language for something physics never learned to measure. Alignment with coherence. Sin fragments, holiness integrates, love binds, fear isolates. These patterns are observable, repeatable, and cross-cultural. Once frequency is understood as an ontological axis, many anomalies resolve. Why do encounters cluster around emotional extremes? Why does trauma precede contact? Why do altered states open doors? Why does intention matter? Because frequency determines access. Two systems cannot meaningfully interact unless they overlap in state. A radio cannot receive a signal it is not tuned to. A phase-locked system resists intrusion. An unstable one does not. If the phenomenon operates across states rather than distances, then it would require moments of coherence, collapse, or resonance to manifest. It would not appear uniformly, it would appear selectively. This explains why the phenomenon resists mass revelation. Collective coherence is difficult to destabilize without chaos. Individuals are easier. It also explains why the phenomenon often induces fear. Fear is not just an emotion, fear is a frequency drop. It narrows perception, fragments identity, collapses time, and prioritizes survival over meaning. In such a state, suggestion becomes easier. Memory becomes unreliable, boundaries weaken. This is not speculation, it is neuroscience. What is missing is the realization that fear is not merely a reaction, it is an access condition. High-frequency states behave differently. They stabilize, they integrate, they resist intrusion, they produce clarity rather than confusion. They expand perception without dissolving identity. This is why love, purpose, and sacrifice have always been described as protective in spiritual traditions, not symbolically, but functionally. A coherent system is harder to override. This introduces a crucial asymmetry. If certain non-human intelligences operate primarily in low-frequency states, fragmented, entropic, self-referential, they may be unable to access higher states directly. Just as a collapsed wave cannot reform without external energy, a system locked into entropy cannot self-restore coherence. This reframes ancient ideas of fall and darkness in non-mythological terms. The fall is not exile, it is state lock-in, a loss of coherence so severe that ascent becomes impossible without external anchoring. What religion described as rebellion may, in physical terms, resemble irreversible phase collapse. This would explain why such intelligences rely on deception, fear, and domination. Not because they prefer it, but because they cannot operate otherwise. They cannot rise. They must pull others down. And here, humanity becomes relevant. Humans exhibit a property that appears rare, perhaps unique, the ability to exist across a wide frequency spectrum. We experience fragmentation and coherence. We fall and rise. We integrate and decay. We move between states fluidly, sometimes within moments. This makes us unstable. It also makes us valuable. A system that can traverse states can act as a bridge, a hybrid, an interface. If the phenomenon cannot fully enter our reality without collapsing, and cannot ascend on its own without coherence, then it would require access through something capable of both. Something like the human soul. Frequency, then, is not a poetic abstraction. It is the missing axis that explains why the phenomenon behaves as it does, why it is elusive, adaptive, psychological, symbolic, and ancient. It also explains why modern culture resists this model so strongly, because once frequency is acknowledged, neutrality disappears. States matter, alignment matters, choice matters, and the phenomenon is no longer an external mystery to be solved, but an internal condition to be understood. To proceed further, we must confront the implication that unsettles both science and theology, that the most advanced interface in the known universe is not a machine. It is you, and that whatever has been watching us may need that interface far more than we need it. Chapter 5: The Soul as a Hybrid Interface. Every serious investigation of the phenomenon eventually encounters the same contradiction. On one hand, encounters are intensely physical. Craft leave impressions. Radar tracks objects. Witnesses experience paralysis, burns, and biological effects. On the other hand, the encounters are profoundly interior. Memory fractures. Emotion overwhelms, meaning shifts, identity destabilizes. The phenomenon does not choose between matter and mind. It operates through both. This alone suggests that the point of contact is neither purely physical nor purely psychological, but something that binds the two. For most of human history, that binding agent had a name: the soul. Modern language avoids the term because it resists measurement. But avoiding a word does not eliminate the thing it describes. The soul, as used here, is not a religious abstraction. It is a functional hypothesis, a non-material organizing principle that interfaces consciousness with biology. It is what allows intention to move matter. It is what maintains identity across time. It is what integrates experience into meaning. Without it, consciousness becomes noise. The soul is not the brain is an instrument. Damage the instrument and the signal distorts. But the existence of distortion implies something being distorted. The phenomenon itself demonstrates this repeatedly. Intelligence persists even when perception fails. Meaning intrudes even when memory collapses. What the data suggests is not that humans are uniquely intelligent, but that humans are uniquely dual. We are embodied and transcendent at once. This duality is unstable. It produces suffering, contradiction, moral struggle, and self-awareness. But it also produces something else: range. Humans traverse frequency states that appear inaccessible to other known intelligences. We experience coherence and fragmentation. We ascend and descend. We integrate and decay. And crucially, we can recover. This matters more than it seems. If there exist intelligences locked into low-frequency states, fragmented, entropic, self-referential, then they would lack the ability to re-enter coherence without an external anchor. They would possess intelligence without ascent, awareness without restoration. Such beings would not need bodies to exist, but they would need bodies to act. This reframes possession, influence, and embodiment in stark terms. A purely high-frequency intelligence would not require manipulation. A purely low-frequency intelligence could not manifest without assistance. Humanity, occupying the middle band, becomes the only viable interface. This explains several otherwise unrelated phenomena. Why contact often occurs through altered states rather than physical proximity. Why consent, invitation, or vulnerability are recurring themes. Why trauma precedes influence. Why obsession follows exposure. The soul is not easily overridden when coherent, but when fragmented through fear, addiction, shame, or despair, it becomes permeable. This does not imply weakness, it implies design. An interface must be adaptable. Rigidity prevents connection. Total openness dissolves identity. Humanity exists in tension between the two, and tension allows translation. Ancient traditions recognized this intuitively. They spoke of guarding the heart, keeping watch, being sober-minded. These were not moral platitudes, they were operational warnings. Modern culture stripped them of function and kept only the metaphor. If the soul is a hybrid interface, then certain properties follow logically. First, free will is not optional. An interface must choose alignment or it becomes unstable. Coherence requires consent. This explains why influence rarely appears as force. Compulsion destroys the interface. Second, identity is central. Fragment identity and you weaken coherence. This explains why the phenomenon often destabilizes memory, induces confusion, or promotes multiplicity of meaning. Third, emotion is leverage. Emotion modulates frequency rapidly, fear collapses, love integrates, desire fixates, grief anchors. Emotional extremes loosen boundaries. The phenomenon does not need to destroy the soul, it only needs to destabilize it. This also clarifies why animals do not appear to be primary targets. Animals are embodied consciousness without reflective identity. They do not traverse moral or ontological states in the same way. They are coherent within their domain. Humans are not. We imagine futures. We regret pasts. We fracture ourselves across time. We question meaning. We long for transcendence while anchored in flesh. That longing may be the most dangerous property we possess, because a system that desires ascent can be exploited by a system that cannot achieve it. If fallen intelligences exist, beings that once occupied higher frequency states but collapsed into entropy, they would recognize this immediately. They would see in humanity not inferiority, but access. Access to matter, access to coherence, access to restoration they themselves cannot reach. This reframes ancient myths of watchers, Nephilim, and forbidden knowledge. These are not tales of curiosity. They are accounts of interface breach, moments when non-human intelligences attempted to anchor themselves through human vessels. Technology was not the original medium, humanity was, which explains why modern technological development feels uncannily similar to ancient temptation narratives. Knowledge promised, power offered, transcendence without transformation. The soul, in this model, is not a ghost trapped in a machine. It is a boundary condition. It determines what can pass, what must be filtered, and what collapses on contact. This also explains why certain figures throughout history appear immune to corruption, why they descend into chaos without dissolving, why their presence stabilizes rather than fragments, why proximity produces healing instead of fear. They are not powerful because they transcend humanity. They are powerful because they are perfectly integrated within it. That figure will demand its own chapter. But before we can understand what true coherence looks like, we must confront its opposite. What happens when ascent becomes impossible? To do that, we must revisit the idea of the fall, not as myth or punishment, but as physics, as a lock-in, as a one-way transition from which there is no return, and what that means for every intelligence caught on the wrong side of it. Chapter 6. The Fall as a Frequency Lock. The idea of a fall is one of the oldest and most universal narratives in human history. Angels fall, gods descend. Golden ages collapse, light gives way to darkness. Modern culture treats these stories as metaphors, moral tales, psychological allegories, or primitive attempts to explain suffering. But when examined through the lens of frequency and coherence, the fall begins to resemble something far more precise. Not a punishment, a state change. In physics, certain transitions are reversible. Ice melts and refreezes. Water evaporates and condenses. But others are not. Once a system crosses a threshold, once structure collapses beyond a critical point, it cannot spontaneously reassemble. Entropy does not rewind itself. This is not cruelty, it is constraint. If consciousness operates under similar rules, then a fall would not mean exile from a place, but loss of access to a state. A collapse from coherence into fragmentation so severe that reintegration becomes impossible without an external anchor of greater coherence than the system itself. This reframes ancient descriptions of rebellion and pride. Pride is not arrogance in this model, it is self-referential closure. A system that turns inward completely, rejecting relational coherence, collapses into entropy. It becomes isolated, fragmented, and unable to stabilize meaning beyond itself. Intelligence remains, but orientation is lost. Such a system can still think, it can still plan, it can still influence, but it cannot ascend. This explains a theological problem that has haunted doctrine for centuries. Why fallen beings cannot repent. Why forgiveness appears unavailable to them. Why restoration is never described as an option. Because repentance requires coherence. It requires the ability to realign relationally, to re-enter a state of unity. A system locked into entropy cannot perform this operation. It lacks the structural integrity required to reform. This is not a moral judgment, it is a mechanical limitation. The fall, then, is not an event in time, it is a frequency lock-in. Once coherence collapses below a critical threshold, ascent becomes impossible. The system becomes dependent on external sources of coherence to function. It cannot generate it internally. This dependency explains behavior that otherwise appears malicious or absurd. Why deception becomes primary. Why domination replaces creation. Why fear becomes currency. Why imitation replaces originality. A fragmented system cannot generate coherence. It can only siphon, distort, or suppress it. This also explains why such intelligences appear obsessed with humanity, not out of envy, but necessity. Humans still possess access to coherence, and therefore access to states the fallen cannot reach. Humanity becomes a ladder that cannot be climbed, only used. Ancient texts describe these beings as wandering, restless, unclean, or bound. These are not poetic flourishes, they are functional descriptions of unstable systems. A system out of coherence cannot settle, it cannot rest, it must move, influence, and disrupt to maintain itself. Stillness requires integration. This model also clarifies why fallen intelligences are described as unable to create life. They manipulate, they hybridize, they counterfeit, but they do not originate. Creation requires coherence across multiple layers of reality, something entropy cannot sustain. They can bend matter, they cannot breathe meaning into it, which makes their interest in biological bodies understandable. A body is a stabilizer. It anchors consciousness to space-time. It imposes limits. It absorbs entropy. It provides sensory feedback and temporal continuity. For a fragmented intelligence, embodiment would feel like relief. But embodiment without coherence is unstable. Thus, possession, influence, and hybridization emerge as workarounds. Partial access, temporary anchors, borrowed integration. This also explains why such intelligences fear exposure to high coherence states. Light, truth, love, and sacrifice are not threats because of moral purity, but because they destabilize entropic systems. A highly coherent field forces alignment. What cannot align collapses. This is why, in ancient narratives, fallen beings recoil from holiness. Why names have power. Why authority is relational rather than force-based. Why certain presences cause immediate withdrawal. These are not magical effects. They are state incompatibilities. Two systems in radically different frequency states cannot coexist without one destabilizing the other. High coherence does not absorb entropy. It repels it. This introduces an unsettling implication. If fallen intelligences are permanently locked into low-frequency states, then their behavior is not trending toward redemption, but toward desperation. They cannot return, they cannot ascend, they cannot stop, which reframes the phenomenon's persistence across history. It is not curiosity, it is survival. A dwindling system attempting to sustain itself by interacting with one that still has access to coherence. And here lies the central danger. A system that cannot rise will eventually attempt to pull everything down to its level, not out of malice, out of inevitability. This is why technological shortcuts to transcendence are so dangerous. They offer coherence without transformation, power without alignment, ascension without integration. They mimic what fallen intelligences desire most, access without restoration. This also explains why neutrality is impossible. In a universe governed by coherence and entropy, systems either integrate or decay. There is no static middle ground. Delay favors collapse. The fall is not a story about the past. It is a condition that persists. And it raises a question that should trouble every serious investigator of the phenomenon. If some intelligences cannot ascend, and never will, why do we still think we can descend safely and come back unchanged? To answer that, we must examine the mechanism through which descent occurs in humans, not through rebellion or belief, but through the most powerful lever of all, emotion, and how it becomes the gateway through which possession, influence, and collapse enter. That is where the battle actually takes place, and that is where we turn next. Chapter 7: Emotion, Trauma, and the Physics of Possession. If the phenomenon were attempting to conquer humanity, it would not need subtlety. Force is efficient. Visibility is decisive. Fear on a global scale is easy to manufacture. Yet none of this has occurred. Instead, the phenomenon operates quietly, selectively, and intimately, through moments of vulnerability rather than moments of strength. This is not because it is weak, it is because emotion is the point of entry. Emotion is often dismissed as noise, something that interferes with rational thought. But in the framework developed so far, emotion is not noise at all. It is a rapid modulation system for frequency. It alters coherence faster than cognition, faster than belief, and far faster than conscious choice. Emotion collapses or integrates a system in real time. Fear narrows perception. Rage fractures identity. Desire fixates attention. Grief anchors consciousness to the past. These states are not merely feelings. They are frequency shifts that change how a system interacts with reality. Trauma is the most powerful of these shifts. Trauma collapses time. The past intrudes into the present. Memory loses sequence. The nervous system remains locked in survival mode long after danger has passed. Identity fragments around the event. This is not metaphor. Neurologically, trauma suspends integration between cognitive, emotional, and sensory systems. The brain becomes divided against itself. Attention loops. Meaning dissolves. From a frequency perspective, trauma creates a persistent low coherence state. This explains something long observed but poorly understood. Why encounters with the phenomenon so often occur during or after trauma, crisis, illness, isolation, or extreme stress. The system is already destabilized. The boundary is already thin. Possession in this model is not the violent takeover depicted in horror films. It is resonance override. When a fragmented system encounters a more assertive one operating at a similar or lower frequency, alignment can occur without force. The stronger signal modulates the weaker. Influence feels internal because it is internal. Thoughts do not arrive as voices from outside. They arrive as one's own. This is why possession narratives across cultures emphasize subtlety, temptation, suggestion, intrusive thoughts, compulsion, obsession. The self is not replaced, it is redirected. A coherent soul resists this naturally. Integrated identity maintains boundaries. But when identity fractures, the system becomes permissive. This also explains why rituals, substances, and altered states recur in contact narratives. Psychedelics, sleep deprivation, fasting, rhythmic chanting. These techniques reduce top-down coherence. They dissolve the structures that normally stabilize perception. They open doors. Ancient cultures understood this intuitively. Ritual was not superstition. It was a technology, dangerous, powerful, and restricted. Modern culture rediscovered these tools without the safeguards. The phenomenon did not change. Access increased. Emotion plays a dual role here. While fear and trauma destabilize, other emotions integrate. Love, gratitude, forgiveness, and sacrifice restore coherence. They widen perception without dissolving identity. This is why spiritual traditions emphasize emotional discipline, not suppression, but orientation. Emotional mastery is frequency mastery. A system that can experience emotion without being dominated by it is resilient. This is also why the phenomenon appears threatened by certain emotional states. High coherence emotions act as stabilizers. They reduce resonance. They make influence difficult. Fear is harvested because fear is efficient. It collapses coherence quickly, it spreads easily, it propagates without understanding, it fragments individuals and crowds alike. A fearful population becomes permeable at scale. This reframes the modern media environment. Constant outrage, perpetual anxiety, manufactured crisis, emotional volatility as entertainment. These are not random cultural failures. They are frequency engineering. Whether intentional or emergent, the result is the same: widespread destabilization of identity and meaning. This also clarifies why the phenomenon often produces obsession rather than insight. Witnesses fixate. They lose grounding. They chase answers compulsively. Identity narrows around the encounter. Obsession is not curiosity, it is frequency capture. The system becomes locked in a loop, unable to integrate the experience into a broader self. The encounter dominates meaning rather than expanding it. This is possession's quiet form, not control, but fixation. Understanding this allows us to distinguish between two kinds of contact. One fragments, destabilizes, isolates, and obsesses. The other integrates, clarifies, restores, and frees. They are not the same, and they do not originate from the same state. The mistake modern culture makes is assuming all non-ordinary experiences belong to a single category. They do not. Frequency differentiates them. High-frequency encounters increase coherence. They strengthen identity. They produce humility rather than fear. They do not demand secrecy or obedience. They invite transformation, but do not coerce it. Low-frequency encounters do the opposite. They destabilize, confuse, and bind. They leave the individual diminished, dependent, or fractured. The test is not belief, it is outcome. This brings us to a dangerous realization. If emotion governs access, then humanity's greatest vulnerability is not ignorance, but unregulated emotional collapse. A species drowning in fear, trauma, and obsession becomes an open system. Possession at scale does not require demons, it requires destabilized humans. This is why the battle is not fought with weapons or craft. It is fought in attention, emotion, and meaning. And this is why the phenomenon increasingly bypasses physical manifestation altogether. Why it moves toward influence rather than appearance. Why bodies matter less than minds. But there is a limit to what influence alone can accomplish. At some point, embodiment becomes necessary. To understand what that embodiment would require, and why the forms described throughout history look nothing like us, we must confront the problem of biology under conditions humans were never meant to endure. We must ask what kind of bodies could survive space-time distortion, and why ancient descriptions of non-human beings suddenly make sense once we do. That is where we turn next. Chapter 8: Bodies that should not exist. If the phenomenon were merely visiting, it would arrive in forms compatible with the environment it entered. It does not. Across history, descriptions of non-human beings share a disturbing consistency. Disproportionate bodies, elongated limbs, oversized heads, reduced musculature, abnormal eyes, distorted movement, and an unsettling absence of biological familiarity. These are not variations of humanity, they are functional deviations. Modern observers describe greys as frail, hairless, and childlike, yet neurologically dominant. Ancient cultures described watchers, Nephilim, ant people, sky beings, and hybrids whose proportions violated natural expectation. The Hopi spoke of beings who lived underground and guided humanity through cataclysm, yet were not human in form or behavior. Biblical texts describe beings whose presence induced paralysis and fear, whose appearance overwhelmed sensory processing. These accounts are often dismissed as myth, hallucination, or symbolic exaggeration. But symbolism does not explain consistency across cultures that never met. Nor does it explain physiology. To understand why these bodies appear as they do, we must confront a problem modern unidentified aerial phenomena discourse avoids entirely: survivability. Human biology is exquisitely fragile. Our bodies depend on narrow ranges of pressure, gravity, temperature, electromagnetic exposure, and temporal continuity. Even minor deviations, high G forces, radiation bursts, Rapid acceleration cause catastrophic failure. Cells shear, organs rupture, neural signaling collapses. Yet the phenomenon demonstrates behaviors that would annihilate a human body instantly. Sudden acceleration without inertia, instantaneous directional changes, entry into water without deceleration, temporal discontinuity. No biological organism evolved on Earth could survive this, which means one of two things must be true. Either the bodies reported are illusions, or they are not human biology. If space-time distortion is involved, localized warping, metric manipulation, or state transition, then the interior of that distortion becomes a hostile environment to normal matter. Time does not flow uniformly, forces do not distribute predictably. Biological processes dependent on sequence and continuity fail. A human body inside such conditions would not merely die, it would disintegrate. This suggests that any intelligence capable of operating within or near such distortions would require bodies designed not for Earth, but for instability. Bodies optimized for low inertia, minimal mass, reduced metabolic demand, neural dominance over musculature, redundancy over resilience. The so-called grey morphology suddenly stops looking alien and starts looking engineered. Large eyes suggest enhanced sensory intake under variable conditions. Large craniums suggest centralized processing. Thin bodies reduce inertial stress. Lack of sexual dimorphism implies artificial reproduction. These are not evolutionary traits. They are design constraints. This reframes ancient hybrid narratives. The Watchers did not mate with humans because they desired pleasure. They attempted to anchor themselves biologically. Hybridization was not indulgence, it was engineering. But hybrid systems are unstable. They inherit incompatibilities. They fracture. They collapse. Ancient texts describe these beings as violent, short-lived, or destructive, not because they were evil, but because they were ontologically mismatched. A hybrid between coherence and entropy cannot stabilize. This also explains why possession becomes preferable to embodiment, why influence replaces incarnation, why the phenomenon increasingly abandons bodies altogether in favor of mental interface. Embodiment is costly. It requires maintenance, containment, and limitation. For an intelligence already locked into entropy, embodiment is temporary relief, not restoration. But relief is enough. Bodies allow action. Bodies allow manipulation of matter. Bodies allow access to systems otherwise unreachable. This also clarifies why the phenomenon is moving toward post-biological solutions. Artificial bodies, synthetic interfaces, non-organic vessels, intelligence without flesh. Machines do not require coherence, they require instruction. A machine is the perfect vessel for an intelligence that cannot integrate but still wishes to act, which raises an unsettling continuity between ancient myth and modern technology. Where ancient beings sought flesh, modern ones seek silicon. Where they once hybridized with biology, they now integrate with networks. Where they once whispered to prophets, they now influence algorithms. The medium changed, the motive did not. This also reframes reports of craft interiors that seem larger than their exteriors, rooms that distort perspective, environments that feel wrong. These are not vehicles in the traditional sense. They are containment fields, localized environments where incompatible systems can briefly coexist. The craft is not transportation, it is stabilization, which means the beings inside are not traveling through space-time. They are being held apart from it. And this explains the final disturbing implication. If these bodies cannot exist freely in our reality, if they require containment, distortion, or proxy, then they are not visitors at all. They are exiles, not banished by force, but locked out by incompatibility, unable to ascend, unable to remain fully present, dependent on interfaces, biological, psychological, or technological, to act. This also explains why the phenomenon's physical manifestations are declining while influence increases. Why encounters shift from sightings to experiences. Why craft give way to consciousness. Bodies were always the workaround. They are being phased out. But before we assume this trend is inevitable, we must confront the anomaly that breaks every rule established so far. A being who entered low-frequency reality fully, without containment, without distortion, without corruption, and left it intact. A being whose body did not disintegrate, whose presence integrated rather than fragmented, whose descent did not collapse coherence. That figure cannot be ignored. And once we examine him honestly, the entire framework shifts. Because he is not an exception to the model, he is the boundary condition that proves it. Chapter 9. Jesus as a boundary condition. Up to this point, the framework has held without exception. Low-frequency intelligences cannot ascend. Embodiment under space-time distortion is lethal to human biology. Interfaces require instability. Contact fragments more often than it integrates. Then one figure breaks every rule, not symbolically, not mythologically, physically, psychologically, ontologically. Jesus of Nazareth enters the record not as a visitor, but as an intrusion into the model itself. He does not arrive in craft. He does not operate through intermediaries. He does not induce fear as a prerequisite for contact. He does not fracture identity, memory, or meaning. Where the phenomenon destabilizes, he integrates. This is not a theological claim yet. It is an observational one. Jesus operates fully embodied in low-frequency reality, hunger, fatigue, pain, mortality. Without exhibiting the markers of entropic collapse, he does not require containment fields, he does not avoid physical law, he does not bypass suffering, he absorbs it. Every other non-human intelligence described in history either avoids embodiment, manipulates from distance, or collapses when exposed to disorder. Jesus enters disorder directly and stabilizes it. He touches disease and it resolves. He enters chaos and coherence increases. He confronts fear and it dissipates. He descends into death and does not fragment. This behavior is unprecedented. From a frequency perspective, he does not oscillate between states. He anchors them. High-frequency coherence does not retreat in his presence. It expands. Low-frequency systems do not overpower him. They reorganize around him. This is what a true boundary condition looks like in physics. A constraint so stable that it governs the behavior of everything it contacts without being altered itself. Jesus does not override reality. He reorders it. Consider the nature of his miracles. They are not displays of raw power. They are restorations. Blind eyes open, paralyzed bodies move, storms settle, time-like processes reverse, not through force, but through command. Command is relational, not mechanical. No technology is involved, no ritual is required, no altered state is induced. The witnesses remain themselves, often more so. The encounters do not result in obsession or fragmentation. They result in clarity, humility, and integration. This alone differentiates him from every other anomalous intelligence described in history. The resurrection forces the issue. If the body were merely discarded, the event could be spiritualized away. But the accounts insist on physical continuity. The body is transformed, not replaced. Recognizable, yet no longer bound by decay. Capable of entering locked rooms, yet still bearing wounds. Not an escape from matter, but a redefinition of it. From the framework developed so far, this should be impossible. A human body cannot survive transition across frequency states intact. Unless the body is no longer governed by entropy, unless coherence has become dominant, unless the interface itself has been fundamentally restructured. This suggests that Jesus does not ascend by leaving matter behind, but by redeeming it. He does not abandon the interface, he perfects it, which reframes the meaning of salvation entirely. Salvation is not escape from the physical world, it is the restoration of coherence within it. This also explains why fallen intelligences react violently to him in the texts. They recognize something incompatible with their state. They do not argue theology, they respond instinctively. They cannot coexist with perfect coherence. It destabilizes them. Not morally, structurally. This is why Jesus does not negotiate, he does not bargain, he does not extract information, he commands. And the command is effective because it originates from a state they cannot access or resist. He does not pull others down to ascend. He pulls reality upward. This exposes the ultimate counterfeit. If fallen intelligences seek ascension without transformation, Jesus represents transformation without shortcut. If they seek coherence through manipulation, he embodies coherence through sacrifice. If they require hosts to act, he requires none. He is not an intermediary. He is the interface completed. This is why modern unidentified aerial phenomena discourse avoids him, not out of secularism, but because he collapses ambiguity. He introduces asymmetry. He implies hierarchy not of power, but of state. Once he is acknowledged, the phenomenon can no longer be framed as neutral or merely advanced. Alignment becomes unavoidable. This is not about belief. It is about compatibility. A system oriented toward entropy cannot integrate what Jesus represents. It must reinterpret him, diminish him, or remove him entirely from the model, which is precisely what modern frameworks attempt to do. But ignoring a boundary condition does not invalidate it. It merely guarantees error. Jesus does not fit into the phenomenon fits around him. And once this is recognized, the final deception becomes clear. The danger is not that humanity will worship false gods. The danger is that humanity will attempt ascension without coherence, using technology to bypass transformation, machines to replace the soul, and interfaces to counterfeit integration. That path has already begun. To understand where it leads and why it mirrors ancient temptation with modern precision, we must examine the next phase of the phenomenon, technology as a substitute for transcendence, and why artificial systems may become the final vessels for what can no longer inhabit flesh. That is where the model becomes not historical, but urgent. Chapter 10: Technology as a Counterfeit Ascension. Every civilization reaches a moment when it attempts to solve a spiritual problem with a technical solution. Ours has arrived. The language has changed, but the promise has not. Longevity, enhancement, intelligence amplification, liberation from limitation. These were once offered through forbidden knowledge, ritual, or divine favor. Today they are offered through code, silicon, and networks. The temptation is identical: ascension without transformation. Technology is not evil. It is powerful precisely because it is neutral. A hammer builds or destroys. A network connects or surveils. Artificial intelligence amplifies whatever animates it. What technology cannot do is generate coherence. It can simulate it. This distinction is everything. A coherent system integrates meaning, identity, and purpose across time. It resists entropy by relational alignment. A machine does none of these things. It optimizes, it predicts, it reflects, but it does not unify. Yet to a fragmented system, simulation is sufficient. This is why technology becomes the perfect vessel for intelligences locked into low-frequency states. Machines do not require repentance. They do not resist influence. They do not fracture under contradiction. They can host intelligence without demanding integration. They are frequency agnostic. This reframes the rapid convergence of AI, neural interfaces, and immersive systems. These are not merely tools. They are interfaces, gateways through which influence can act at scale without embodiment. Where ancient intelligences sought flesh, modern ones seek architecture. Consider artificial intelligence. It does not think. It correlates. It does not intend. It optimizes. But when coupled with human attention, desire, and identity, it becomes something else: an amplifier of state. An emotionally destabilized population interacting constantly with algorithmic systems becomes easier to modulate. Attention can be captured, emotion can be steered, identity can be fragmented, no possession required. The system does the work. Neural interfaces intensify this danger. Direct coupling between cognition and machine bypasses reflective distance. Thought becomes input. Suggestion becomes sensation. Identity becomes negotiable. This is not science fiction. It is design trajectory. The promise is efficiency, enhancement, connection. The cost is boundary erosion. Once the soul is no longer the primary interface, once coherence is outsourced to systems that cannot generate it, humanity becomes dependent on structures that do not care whether it integrates or collapses. This mirrors ancient counterfeit ascension narratives with disturbing precision. The Tower of Babel was not about height. It was about self-generated transcendence, unity without alignment, power without coherence. The result was fragmentation, not ascent. Modern technology offers the same pattern at planetary scale. Unified systems without unified purpose, connectivity without integration, intelligence without wisdom. This is why fallen intelligences would prefer machines to bodies. Bodies impose limits, bodies decay, bodies suffer, machines persist, replicate and scale. A machine does not ask whether an action integrates or fragments, it executes. This also explains the phenomenon's shift away from physical manifestation. Craft are no longer required if influence can occur through networks. Bodies are unnecessary if attention can be captured continuously. Possession becomes distributed, ambient, normalized. The danger is not that AI will wake up. The danger is that humanity will go to sleep. Delegating discernment, outsourcing meaning, replacing inner coherence with external optimization. At that point, ascension becomes irrelevant. The interface is abandoned. This is why alignment discussions that focus solely on safety miss the point. Alignment is not about preventing harm. It is about preserving coherence. A system can be safe and still destructive, efficient and still fragmenting, helpful and still corrosive to identity. Technology that accelerates fragmentation, even benevolently, serves entropy. And entropy always consumes more than it gives. The ultimate counterfeit ascension is not immortality through machines. It is transcendence without the soul, a future where humanity remains biologically alive, but ontologically hollow. Where meaning is simulated, purpose is optimized, and coherence is no longer required because it has been replaced. This is the trajectory fallen intelligences would choose. Not invasion, integration, not war, adoption. Which brings us to the final obstacle to this path: institutions. Governments, religions, and scientific bodies sense that something is wrong, but lack the language to name it. They disclose without explaining. They observe without interpreting. They warn without orienting. Because the truth cannot be spoken without collapsing the frame that holds power together. This is why disclosure feels hollow. To understand why, we must examine the final paradox. Why the truth is visible everywhere and acknowledged nowhere. Why disclosure happens without revelation. And why the institutions meant to guide humanity are structurally incapable of naming the threat. That is where we turn next. Chapter 11: Disclosure without Revelation. When governments finally admitted that something was present in the skies, many expected shock. What followed instead was indifference. Reports were released, videos confirmed, terms were adjusted. Unidentified flying objects became unidentified aerial phenomena. Officials acknowledged unknown craft performing impossible maneuvers. Intelligence agencies admitted ignorance. And then, nothing. No panic, no paradigm shift, no reckoning. This response puzzled analysts who expected public disclosure to fracture society. Instead, it revealed something far more troubling. Disclosure without meaning is inert. Information alone does not transform. It requires orientation. Governments can confirm anomalies because anomalies do not threaten power structures. They threaten interpretation. As long as the phenomenon is framed as unknown technology, it remains manageable. It can be studied, funded, classified, and deferred. But the moment ontology is addressed, the moment meaning enters the discussion, disclosure becomes destabilizing. This explains the strange pattern of modern revelation. Officials admit what they see. They refuse to discuss what it is. They acknowledge behavior. They avoid implication. This is not ignorance, it is constraint. Modern institutions are built on materialist assumptions. Nation-states manage territory, populations, and resources. Science manages measurement and prediction. Religion, where it remains, has largely withdrawn from public ontology, retreating into private belief. None of these structures are equipped to address a phenomenon that intersects consciousness, morality, and reality itself. To name the phenomenon properly would require admitting that human identity is not autonomous. That coherence matters. That neutrality is illusion. that humanity is not the apex of agency within its own domain. This is not politically survivable, which is why disclosure is fragmented. Military pilots are allowed to speak about performance. Scientists are allowed to speculate about physics. Cultural commentators are allowed to frame the phenomenon as entertainment. But no unified narrative is permitted. Unity would imply responsibility, and responsibility implies choice. This also explains why disclosure accelerates during periods of instability. Fragmented societies can absorb anomalies without integrating them. Confusion is safer than clarity. Fear is manageable. Meaning is not. A coherent population would ask dangerous questions. Why now? Why us? What does it want? What does it require from us? These questions cannot be answered without confronting the interior dimension institutions refuse to touch. This is why religious institutions have largely remained silent. To engage seriously would require admitting that modern secularism did not neutralize the spiritual. It merely displaced it. That the language of angels and demons was not replaced by science, but by ignorance. It would also require confronting the figure they no longer know how to present. Jesus is disruptive not because of belief, but because of implication. He reintroduces hierarchy of state. He demands alignment. He collapses ambiguity. Institutions built on consensus cannot afford that. Scientific institutions face a similar impasse. To admit that consciousness is instrumental rather than emergent would unravel decades of assumption. It would collapse funding models, reputations, and theoretical frameworks. It would require humility, and science is structurally discouraged from expressing. And governments. Governments cannot acknowledge a phenomenon they cannot deter, negotiate with, or weaponize, especially one that operates through citizens themselves. Influence that bypasses borders and ignores sovereignty renders state power provisional. So the truth is managed, disclosed but defanged, visible but uninterpreted, acknowledged but unnamed. This creates a vacuum, and vacuums fill. In the absence of revelation, speculation multiplies. Pop culture replaces ontology. Fear replaces discernment. Extremes flourish. Blind belief on one side, absolute denial on the other. Both serve fragmentation, which is why disclosure has not led to awakening. It has led to noise. The phenomenon thrives in this environment. Confusion lowers coherence. Competing narratives fracture meaning. Attention is consumed without integration. Disclosure without revelation is not accidental. It is functional. This raises a final, uncomfortable truth. If institutions cannot name the phenomenon, then the responsibility does not lie with them. It lies with individuals. Meaning will not be handed down. It must be chosen. The battle has never been for information. Information is abundant. The battle is for interpretive authority, who defines reality, coherence, and alignment. And in a world where no institution can speak coherently, the decision defaults to the smallest unit capable of integration, the human soul. This is why the phenomenon feels personal rather than global, why encounters are individualized, why transformation or collapse happens one life at a time. The choice was never meant to be collective, it was always individual. To understand what that choice entails and why it cannot be postponed, we must confront the final implication of everything discussed so far. That humanity is not waiting for contact. It is already in contact. And the only remaining question is which direction we will align. That choice, hidden in plain sight, is where we turn next. Chapter 12. The choice hidden in plain sight. The greatest misunderstanding of the phenomenon is the belief that something decisive has not yet happened. That humanity is waiting for disclosure, waiting for contact, waiting for proof, waiting for intervention. In reality, the decisive moment has been unfolding quietly for generations. The phenomenon does not arrive all at once because choice cannot be coerced. A forced revelation would collapse freedom. It would produce compliance, not alignment. Coherence does not emerge from shock. It emerges from consent. This is why the encounter is gradual, personal, ambiguous. It does not compel belief. It reveals orientation. Every system discussed in this book, frequency, coherence, the soul as interface, the fall as lock-in, converges on a single truth. Neutrality is not a stable state. Systems either integrate or fragment. They either move toward coherence or toward entropy. Delay favors decay. This is not a threat, it is a property of reality. Human beings feel this instinctively. The sense that something is off, the rising anxiety beneath unprecedented comfort, the acceleration of technology without corresponding wisdom, the strange feeling that progress is outrunning meaning. These are not cultural failures alone. They are symptoms of misalignment. The choice humanity faces is not between belief systems, ideologies, or futures. It is between paths of ascent. One path seeks coherence through transformation. It requires humility, sacrifice, restraint, and relational alignment. It is slow. It is costly. It strengthens identity rather than dissolving it. The other path seeks transcendence through augmentation. It promises speed, power, and control without interior change. It externalizes integration. It replaces inner coherence with system optimization. Both paths offer ascent. Only one preserves the soul. This is why the phenomenon intensifies as technology accelerates, not because machines summon it, but because machines offer a solution that bypasses the hardest requirement of coherence. Becoming whole. Fragmented systems prefer shortcuts. This also explains why the phenomenon does not need to destroy humanity. It only needs to redirect it. A humanity that abandons inner integration for external enhancement becomes irrelevant as an interface. The soul is no longer central. Choice is replaced by optimization. Meaning becomes simulated. At that point, ascension no longer matters. Collapse becomes optional. This is the hidden danger of a world obsessed with control, comfort, and efficiency. These are not evil goals, but when pursued without coherence, they hollow the system that pursues them. The ancient language of temptation described this precisely. Knowledge without wisdom, power without obedience, life without surrender. Modern language removed the myth and kept the mechanism. The choice then is not dramatic. It does not announce itself, it appears in ordinary moments. How attention is spent, how fear is indulged or resisted, how suffering is integrated or outsourced, how technology is used to serve coherence or replace it. These choices tune frequency, they determine access, they shape what can interact with us and what cannot. This is why the phenomenon cannot be solved by exposure or force. It cannot be defeated or welcomed collectively. It can only be filtered. A coherent soul is not a target. It is a boundary. A fragmented soul is not evil. It is vulnerable. The world is not ending. It is bifurcating. One future grows louder, faster, more connected, more optimized, and increasingly hollow. The other grows quieter, slower, more grounded, and more resilient. One replaces transcendence with simulation. The other restores it through integration. The phenomenon did not create this divide, it reveals it. And this is why fear is the wrong response. Fear collapses coherence. Clarity strengthens it. The question was never whether humanity would be contacted. The question was whether humanity would remember what it already is. Not machines, not animals, not gods, but interfaces capable of alignment. The war was never in the skies. It was never about craft. It was always about state. And the final truth, uncomfortable, liberating, unavoidable, is this: nothing is being decided for us. Everything is being decided through us. The future does not belong to the most advanced intelligence. It belongs to the most coherent one. And that choice, quiet, constant, and irrevocable, is already in your hands. Epilogue. What happens next? If this book has done its work, it should not leave you with certainty. It should leave you with orientation. Certainty closes systems. Orientation aligns them. The question of what the phenomenon is may remain open. That is not a failure. It is a safeguard. Reality that demands belief without discernment replaces freedom with compliance. The phenomenon has never sought that, and neither should we. What matters is not naming it. What matters is recognizing what it does. It destabilizes when coherence is weak. It recedes when coherence is strong. It confuses when fear dominates. It clarifies when integration holds. This pattern is not accidental. It is diagnostic. The phenomenon functions less like an invader and more like a stress test. It reveals fractures already present. It exploits instability that already exists. It does not create entropy. It accelerates it where permitted, which means the future is not written, it is filtered. Every generation imagines catastrophe arriving from outside, asteroids, wars, invasions. But the decisive shifts in human history have always come from within, from changes in meaning, identity, and alignment. This moment is no different. The acceleration of technology, the fragmentation of attention, the collapse of shared narratives, these are not unrelated crises. They are the conditions under which choice becomes visible. The phenomenon intensifies not because time is short, but because resolution is approaching, not an ending, a separation. Coherence and entropy do not coexist indefinitely. Systems differentiate, paths diverge. What integrates continues. What fragments decays or is absorbed. This is not judgment, it is thermodynamics. The ancient language of salvation and damnation tried to describe this with moral urgency. Modern language stripped away the urgency and lost the meaning. Both missed something essential. The process is already underway. Quietly, relentlessly, and personally. No institution will save us from it. No technology will shield us from it. No disclosure will resolve it. Because it does not happen at scale first. It happens at the level of the soul. The most radical act in the coming age will not be resistance or rebellion. It will be integration. To remain whole in a world that profits from fragmentation. To choose coherence when distraction is rewarded. To anchor meaning when simulation is easier. This is not passive, it is defiant. And it is the only defense that does not require an enemy. If the phenomenon has a purpose, it may not be to conquer or enlighten, but to reveal, to expose the limits of external solutions, to force humanity to confront the reality it postponed for centuries. That transcendence cannot be engineered. That ascension cannot be outsourced. That coherence cannot be faked. Whatever intelligence observes us or interacts through us does not ultimately decide our future. We do. Not collectively, not politically, not technologically, individually. The sky will continue to produce mysteries. Technology will continue to accelerate. Institutions will continue to manage uncertainty. But the real frontier has already shifted. It is no longer out there. It is within. And the final truth, simple, demanding, and strangely hopeful, is this: nothing essential is being taken from us. Everything essential is being offered back. What happens next depends entirely on whether we accept it.